And welcome, Dan. I am thrilled to introduce you on the Why Change podcast, coming to you live from the World Alliance for Arts Education's Virtual World Summit. Dan, you and I first connected at the last World Alliance for Arts Education Summit in Frankfurt, Germany in October 2019. And since then, I've had the really distinct pleasure of getting to know you a little bit and specifically learning about your climate crisis focused work with performance artists and young people that you work with to develop and respond to the climate crisis that's been impacting our world. You all have such tremendous work and you have my deep, deep respect. And I'm so excited to talk about some of these things with you today. So welcome today here to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's good to not just be with you, but with people who are present and then people who will hear our dialogue at another time.
Absolutely. Well, first, can you share just a little bit about your own background? I know first that you are a theater educator, a pedagogue, a former president of the International Drama Education Association, and one of the founding leaders of the World Alliance for Arts Education. So can you go back in history and bring us up to speed with your arts education origin story?
Yeah, Jeff, in the same way that you have performed an introduction, I think I should perform my introduction as well, a little. I will certainly go back in time, but I'd like to read you a poem which I have selected, which has come from our current community performance education project in the Amazon. And I think, as many will remember and will know, we're no longer talking about climate crisis, but climate collapse. And when you witness rivers turning to dust and forests turning to ash, people being born with asthma, you realize that the situation is much more critical than just a crisis. I think it was really interesting that Greta Thunberg changed her language when she began to speak not about climate change, but then to climate crisis, and then from climate crisis to climate collapse. So we're living in a critical moment, and I'm really proud to be with you, but I'm also really pleased that there is this opportunity to talk about the importance of arts and arts education in how we respond to this critical threshold. So this is called Energies of Life, and this is a poem written with and for young African Indigenous people, to their community, to themselves, and to the world. I create a kite and see your care, mother, in my hands, cutting and sewing my clothes. I tie the ribbons of its tail and see your wisdom, Father, in the dance of your fingers, weaving nets in the shade of the little square. I fly my dreams, their cord vibrating with so much history and desire. And though mute, failed, and condemned, I read the future in the winds and write the ethics of the rivers in the parched red sky to perform and unveil the values of the giants and keep safe my life in our home. So this is a poem written by people who have been evaluated and assessed as illiterate, but people who are capable of reading the wind, reading the surface of the rivers, reading silence, and reading the future. And these people are part of another kind of education with other kinds of values that I think are very relevant to this moment that we're living today. And so I say all of that to you because I know that in addition to my presence here, we're also talking about assessment and evaluation, and this is extremely important. So I have, in a sense, situated myself, but when I really look back on my own early years, as you put it, the first 10 years perhaps of my work inside theatre education, they begin inside Oxford University, where you couldn't study living authors. That's quite a profound principle in prohibition. In other words, it makes you really aware of the past as alive in some ways, but it meant that I couldn't really respond to authors dealing with contemporary questions. But I also was having to suffer a deeply authoritarian education. And the only place where I could actually breathe and experiment and really look at contemporary questions was in the theatre. We created a theatre company without knowing we were doing that. I thought people worked for 6 months of the year on a theatre production, not 6 weeks or 3 weeks. But in that time, I began to work my first play on Marat Sade by Peter Weiss. And I had the privilege as well of going through some workshops with Jerzy Grotowski. But my own experience of theatre as education really began as a kind of protest against the suffocating authoritarianism inside Oxford University. And I spent all of my semesters creating theatre, and then between semesters caught up with my academic work. But what was interesting was that I really sharpened my imagination, I really sharpened my intelligence, and I really learned that theatre is a space of determining yourself, of understanding contemporary questions, and of working and creating community. And then when I graduated, and I had the good fortune of graduating with grades that were sufficient for me to return to do a master's and then a doctorate. And I think that was because of how theatre prepared me for the performance of exams, of evaluation and everything else. But I worked for a year with Edward Bond, autodidact. And Bond has this very famous line in King Lear. So he's rewriting Shakespeare. He's, in a sense, making Shakespeare contemporary. And he says, we don't need a map of the future. We need a method of change. And he's talking about the performance of authoritarian regimes, including Stalinism. But he's also looking at a very radical dimension to his own rational theatre. That's theatre as education, or drama as education, and talking about the need to learn how to ask questions. And I think working as his apprentice, and I really consciously positioned myself in the National Theatre, in the Royal Court Theatre, in the Mile End Theatre in the East End of London, I positioned myself as a person learning the trade, the craft, the skill of writing, of directing, and of performing, but performing through the very radical pedagogy of learning to ask new questions. And I say that because, you know, you couldn't study Bond at Oxford. I did, of course, then study as my doctoral focus. But what was important was that I was learning with a person who had escaped or been excluded from formal education. So he had learned by teaching himself theatre as narrative, theatre as questioning, theatre as protest, theatre as self-transformation. But I worked with him and at the same time met another key mentor, another key person within my own early formation as a kind of drama theatre education activist. And that was Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya. And Ngugi had been exiled after a year in prison without trial, after his community theatre had been burned to the ground. And if with Bond I had learned the radical power of questioning, because I had been studying literature and particularly poetry, and with Bond I encountered the power of metaphor, you know, the power of being able to actually really provoke an audience to use its own intelligence to question and to interpret. With Ngugi, I learned the power of language of the stage, and specifically not as a poet, but as a person who was dramatizing narratives that were intimately connected, but in direct conflict. That's to say, a narrative of colonization and a narrative of resistance, and a narrative in a way of self-transformation. But what shocked me about Ngugi working in community theatre in the heart of the Africa Centre in London in the early 80s was that he was very articulate and lucid, and that all the performance was on stage about the decolonization of the mind. But he was entirely silent and paralyzed when the narratives embedded in the body began to become compulsive in performance, off stage, in theatre rehearsals, and in all the kind of rehearsals coming up to the performance. So the stage was lucid, the public voice was lucid, but the intimate voice, the voice of whispering, of doubt, of uncertainty, of fury, of rage, which erupted in our rehearsals, needed another kind of dramaturgy, needed another kind of pedagogy, needed another kind of, not mediation, but care to ensure that people didn't destroy themselves in attempting to learn their performances, craft their performances for public performance. So with Ngugi, I realized the need for the decolonization of what I call the mindful body. That's to say, the ways in which the theatre of oppression, the theatre of exclusion, the theatre of mutilation becomes internalized within our reflexes. And without a different kind of performance, and I'm not talking about drama therapy or theatre therapy at this point, but in that I began to see that I needed to move much further, and work inside communities, not inside theatres. And that took me to Manchester and then to Derry, and that's where I really conclude my response to your question. In Manchester, a young African Asian youth was murdered in a school playground, and it was witnessed and traumatized all the people who witnessed it. And the city council at that time in England, Northern England, post-industrial world, couldn't bring the different schools, different ethnic and cultural communities together to understand what had happened and then to find a way of transforming it. And we were brought in, an African, Irish, in my case, Welsh, Canadian collection of artists, of performance educators. We came in to do what we could, listening to the young people to find a narrative that could bring them together. So what was powerful there was to discover that theatre in the playground, theatre outside the syllabus, had an immensely important role in educating people for intercultural and transcultural learning, if you want, for people to become literate in that. And I took that experience, I took those young people who I'm still in contact with today, so this is nearly 40 years ago. You know, I took those young people with me to Ireland, to the north of Ireland, when I was invited to visit a region living through undeclared civil war, undeclared war. And in that place, I learned another dimension, and these elements have all stayed with me until this day. I learned the power of the dead, the living power of the dead. In Oxford, I had been forbidden to study the dead. But in Ireland, I came across the dead as living protagonists. And I had to discover that that power, that theatrical power, that gaze of the past was there present beneath the stage, backstage, beneath the objects, within the objects that we bring onto the stage. And that was a profound education, not just in decolonization of the mind, decolonization of the body, decolonization of memory, but also decolonization of the imagination, and understanding that history and memory nurture and feed the imagination. And if we have a toxic memory, a toxic history, our imagination can also be toxic, and it can disable our search for solutions. So I think from this response, I'm just sort of saying to my first decade, really was a process of learning with really, really outstanding dramaturgs and pedagogues using theatre as pedagogy. But it was also working within community, not just creating community, but seeing the challenges of how do you transform very, very dangerous histories, so dangerous that you actually have to imprison the history in a sense, or you have to repress it or deny it. You have to, in a way, control the past. But how do you deal with that in terms of creating an open future, a wider horizon, and a horizon which is not just human rights, but sustainable life? You know, and so I speak about all of that because I couldn't study that in the syllabus. All of that learning came off stage, backstage, and came outside formal education. And I remember vividly, just to close, in the first World Alliance for Education, Arts Education Summit, World Summit, I remember people commenting that most artists learn their skills, their aesthetics, their practice outside of school. And this raised radical questions about what was the role of the World Alliance for Arts Education, the UNESCO and everything else. What are we doing? What are we trying to do in order to ensure that the arts are effective pedagogies? You know?
Well, that is a wonderful question to sort of end your history on. And I will just say, every time that we speak, I'm blown away by both the community-focused grappling with what we often talk about in a non-community way, the theater education as a vehicle for understanding or challenging, amplifying histories, as you were just describing, but often spoken about in a very almost clinical fashion in terms of education policy. So I wonder about that time that you just brought us up to in the early 2000s, when the World Alliance for Arts Education was forming, was working in conjunction with, maybe that's not the right term, but with UNESCO to catalyze some international collaborations to advance this field of practice. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like and how maybe that leveraged us to get to where we are now, convening the 10th World Summit on Arts Education?
Sure, Jeff. I mean, I really welcome this chance to, in a way, talk a little about history, not my history, but a larger history, and a history which is of organized arts educators, the attempt and the achievement to bring together arts educators from languages which shouldn't be separated. I mean, in other words, I'm saying not just drama and theater, music, visual arts, and dance. And then, of course, the other languages which are not yet given that kind of status. But I also understand these languages, each of them as corresponding to a different perception, a different intelligence, and that together they represent our full, flexible, creative, and often subversive intelligence. You know, so I think that's important. And I want to begin again with another poem. And I'm doing this because I know that it's not so easy on Zoom to perform, though I could sing, and I might do while we're talking. But I want to bring another poem together because I think the radical power of poetry is present in all of the arts languages and visual arts, as well as, you know, all the dance and everything that I've done. This is called good living, and I choose this word good living, this concept, indigenous concept, both ancestral as well as contemporary, because it's the opposite to ecocide, which is what we're living today. Every dawn, nets emerged from your needle, a precise white pen, weaving living wisdom into a web of concern. Even well-made, fish always escaped, transforming our boats into flowing feasts. And suddenly the sun forgot to rise, I swear. In the darkness, we breathed so much ash. Marabas City got sick, became blind, lost its voice, and our canoes returned hungry. The dust settled, but nothing was ever the same. Today in the mall, I saw my dad's extinct canoe, beautifying the billboard, Marabas City, the future. Our river Tocantins, traded for mandates, has become a favor in an aluminium dream. I feel betrayed, shaken by the cheering crowd. I search for any memory that can illuminate this blackout that threatens the world's future. I've already lost years scrolling post after post, message after message, to relieve me of the hunger that addicts me to the consuming of my own imagination. I walk tense, impatient, ashamed, confused. Take my portrait, kid, right here in front of my river, an old woman requests. Herbs in her hand. My granddaughter wants to link me to the Maori people who heal their rivers on the other side of the world. The kindness of this sage frees me from my solitude, and suddenly drums reskinned with love by youth already creating a network of good living begin a beat so synchronized, my pulse quickens and my humanity flows. So that is incredible for me to read. I'm almost moved to tears, because that is written in 2017, 2.5 years before the pandemic. But it could be describing the pandemic. It's describing what all the young people where I live and work in the Amazon were conscious of and were perceiving. Now in 2000, and now I want to talk a little about history in response to your second question. I mean it like this. I think there needs to be greater precision in the World Alliance, not in Jeff, but in the World Alliance, about history. Because I think history, narrative, is the narrative of many performances woven together. And those narratives appear in very, very specific places and specific times. And I think being specific about that is a way of sort of asking the World Alliance and all of our practitioners to take care of good documentation, and not just documentation in the body and through oral history, but also good documentation and making sure that we really understand and learn from our history or our histories. So in 2006, I became president after 6 years as the president of the General Meeting Committee. So I began at 39 when I was in Brazil. I didn't move to Brazil recently. In the very beginning of 1998, I was in Brazil, and I was invited to stand because the existing president had stepped down, and had stepped down because there was so much conflict inside the General Meeting Council. And that conflict, I think, was a lot to do with both my own learning from IDEA about the importance of bringing the regions together as equals, but at the same time bringing the different artistic languages together as equals. And so in 2004, I began as president, and I was relatively young, I mean, compared to most presidents, both then and now. But also I was involved in the build-up to the first UNESCO World Congress or Conference on Arts Education. And in 2006, it was a very, very visionary decision by INSEA, the visual arts education a society. It was very, very visionary to bring us together in preparation for the Inviseo, for the World Congress in Lisbon. And it was very important, this, because I was there as the president, and I was bringing with me more than 8 years of experience of IDEA and all of IDEA's World Congresses. And I was meeting, as the youngest president, meeting my contemporaries in the other arts languages. And at the World Alliance, what struck all of us as extremely wounding and disrespectful was that before the World Congress, the UNESCO World Congress began, we were asked to sign the outcomes, sign a letter, sign a document, a roadmap. And we refused. We just said, we as partners of UNESCO are involved in a living debate. And this living debate at that time was the shift in 2006 from the industrial paradigm to an digital information paradigm. I mean, we're talking about technological convergence without even being able to imagine the scale and speed of that convergence as we are living it today. We definitely weren't imagining Zoom, we weren't imagining smartphones, computers in every single home throughout the world almost. So at that time in 2006, we began with a kind of protest against UNESCO's United Nations political culture. But I think what was interesting was that already, because of the nature of the time we were living in, we knew a paradigm shift was taking place, and there needed to be an education, not just to deal with post-industrial violence that was ravaging cities throughout the world and continents, but was also, we needed to be able to talk about a new paradigm of education. And in our understanding, this new paradigm of education was based in the artistic languages. So arts-rich pedagogies. This wasn't arts for, good for everyone. This wasn't arts as a discipline in the corner of the curriculum. This was the entire curriculum embedded in our creative, transformative, reflexive, expressive languages. And I mention this because the World Alliance, when it declared its manifesto, its declaration, it shook UNESCO to the bone. You know, UNESCO expected us to be diplomatic, compliant, grateful that we were even at the table. But we were put under pressure to rewrite one of the key verbs in that declaration, that United Declaration. But above all, we were asking UNESCO, we weren't even asking, we were insisting that UNESCO enter a dialogue to create policy. And I think this is a very significant difference. I need to underline this, that what we achieved in those first summits was the integration, and it wasn't simple. And I was the first president of the World Alliance, and I was president for 4 years, even though we had a principle of annual rotation. No one had the time at that point, because they were academics with heavy responsibilities. No one had the time to really invest so much in the World Alliance. So what I want to say really is that we created a forum to make policy. So the WAAE was conceived of as a political forum, as a policy-making forum. And what it needed was research, networking, and advocacy in order to substantiate its claims, but also then to discover people like, I guess, myself and others who are not necessarily inside institutions, working in diverse places off radar, beneath the radar. And then we needed to acquire advocacy skills. And I say this because I think one of the great achievements of the World Alliance between 2006 and then advocating for an unprecedented second UNESCO World Conference on Arts Education, one of the great achievements was to actually think politically at all times in relation to people who don't think like ourselves. In other words, to find ways of dialogue with other sectors within society and other biomes, other regions, in order to make sure that a new paradigm of education, not of competition, but of solidarity and cooperation, could be nurtured inside every school. And I think it's another podcast, it's another debate, but I think it's an extremely important discussion to be held. How did how did the World Alliance shift from being a political forum for paradigmatic educational policy to another academic space where important research is exchanged, where important performances as publications are seen and analyzed, but where perhaps we need to recover that passion, that vision of saying we need a new policy-making space as arts educators. And I close this response to your question by simply saying, if in 2006 we were on the threshold between an industrial paradigm and an information or informational paradigm, Today, we are on another threshold between ecocide and good living. I mean, that is an extraordinary shift. In a sense, it's present because we're in a rupture from the industrial age and all of the different exploitations of nature that create climate change and climate crisis. But then everything accelerates and we move into the situation of ecocide, not just genocide, but ecocide. And that implies another kind of courage, another kind of vision, another kind of performance. And I think that's where we are today.
I remember back in 2019 in Frankfurt when the conferees were authoring this Frankfurt Declaration because of some of those performances viewed as publication, because of the dialogues of research that you shared about eco-pedagogy, that I know I shared about youth-led creative social transformation. There was a dialogue about the role of arts educators and thus maybe the World Alliance for Arts Education in engaging in these types of debates. So on a practical level, could you talk a little bit about your work now as an eco-pedagogue and what that might mean both in theory and what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, sure. I moved from a time, I spent 12 years of my life traveling throughout the world. And I spent 6 of those 12 years traveling in perhaps 60 or 70 countries. After that, I have spent the last 12 years of my life in 2 streets. And in those 2 streets, bringing with me the kind of insights I was learning with others and in communities, in community performance, community education through theatre, obviously, but not just theatre, but as a poet, as a visual artist, as a sculptor. And I brought, in fact, to the World Alliance and to various pre-World Alliance regional summits, I brought the construction of huge monumental sculptures, which were themselves spaces of performance. So there was an internal, intimate voice and a public voice. When I came to the Amazon, again, so I came back after working in 1999, I came back in 2008 as a kind of visual artist and as a performance artist. I was asked to create a sculpture, but in fact, we transformed over 10 years an entire community into a theatre. So the walls of the houses, of the 380 houses on the edge of the river Tocantins became cinemas, became screens. The little square, the banks of the river, the sky, the streets all became performance spaces. And we created a kind of contemporary Amazonian dance theatre for popular education, for community education, for transformation. This was working with people who had all been failed. So they'd been failed for 500 years, but then they were inside schools that were delivering the worst state education in the whole of Brazil. And Brazil already with one of the greatest social apartheids in the world. But these people were also living ecocide. They were living what I described earlier, rivers turning to dust, being tarmacked into highways, with huge mega industrial projects transforming forests into desert and into a place for huge mining projects. So we were talking about a process which young people and their families were living every single day, but were even unable to name because they didn't know they lived in the Amazon and they didn't know their origins, their African and indigenous origins. So today, this work over 12 years has been taking time, 7 days a week, living inside that community, with young people becoming teenagers, becoming leaders, becoming advocates, becoming international performers, displaying pedagogies which are both poetic, dialogic, transformative, reflexive, visionary, and at the same time trying to transform those compulsive histories that are embedded in our unconscious, in our imaginary, in our skin, in our apparently inarticulate memory, until we come into contact with dance, we come into contact with theatre. And these young people with me, and actually with Ralph Buck, one of the 4 co-founders of the World Alliance, we created a community university of the rivers. And we created a community education program for the nurturing of people that could make a decisive shift from an anthropocentric vision of the world, human-centered of the world, to an ecocentric or biocentric vision of the world. So in our perspective, we were not just dealing with people who needed to transform silence into voice, and voice into community, and community into policy in every single sphere of city life, but they were also connecting with their forest origins, with their river origins, with their biocentric origins, where they were able to recover in order to cure themselves, in order to become the new leaders, not just of their community, but of their generation. And I think in this respect, I'm sort of anticipating what I know is an important focus for you. In this respect, we were dealing with people who, as I explained in my first poem, are failed, are mutilated by formal education as a theater where people learn complicity because of fear. Complicity, which can be, of course, idealized as diplomacy. And diplomacy has its place. But it is very important that people who are coming through formal education to be complicit in the destruction of the Amazon, or in the transformation of the oldest technology in the world into a technology which is now emitting carbon gases rather than storing them. And in our process, we believed that through dance, through performance broadly, through the understanding of all public space and intimate space as inherently theatrical, and the dramatic nature of the imagination, the poetic nature of the imagination, we created a form of learning and defining the impacts of what we were doing, which completely conflict with formal education. Just to give you an idea, before meeting you today, I'm working with a 26-year-old performance artist who began working with us when she was 13. She's an international artist that you met in Frankfurt. She's one of the key dancers. She is a person who recovered her sleeping African origins and is now recovering her indigenous origins. And as a person who, for the 5th consecutive year, is trying to get into university to study dance pedagogy or performance pedagogy. And she can't get there because, in spite of the extraordinary, to use this kind of neo-colonial language of assessment and measurement, in spite of the extraordinary impacts on her own life, her own family, her own community, her own city, on the region and on the world, despite her skills as a pedagogue, as an eco-pedagogue, that's to say, with an ecocentric vision of the world, despite all of that, she can't pass the university entrance exam. And she can't pass that exam because she is being asked to perform a very cruel test of her intelligence under intolerable circumstances, which we today still call university entrance examinations. So, if we judge the traditional, the dominant pedagogies which have brought us to this point of ecocide, to evaluate the young performances, the young performers, and the young arts educators that need to create a new horizon, need to reinvent the future, need to reinvent education, I think we are using the criteria and the models which are inappropriate. And I think we need to look to those continents that have been at a greater distance from these formal authoritarian models of evaluation and everything else. We need to look to these peoples, these communities, these territories where there is still a very strong presence of ancestral knowledge and ancestral pedagogies, of methods of passing on knowledge and acquiring new knowledge. But at the same time, we need to be talking with these people about contemporary models or contemporary pedagogies in order to ensure that we reinvent time. This is the most crucial thing for me. Can these young people help us, because of how they're positioned, to a future that they are already denied? Can these people help us to define the pedagogies, the models of evaluation and of assessing their contribution, but also contributions that are diverse, that can be useful to us in passing from a time of great danger to a time of greater security.
So you mentioned the conference theme, and you're talking about these possibilities. So I really wonder that, thinking of this assessment, which is what we've been talking about now for 4 days, what does a co-created Indigenous assessment or evaluation look like for this eco-pedagogical setting that you're describing? Like, from your perspective, how can we assess the arts learning of young eco-centered artists and their impact in their own communities?
I mean, this is such a rich question, Jeff. I think we could spend, you and I, 4 days talking about it, right? But I look at the beads that the seeds that I'm wearing today. They're from Monte Pascoal, Eastern Mountain, where Brazil was first sighted and then colonized by the Portuguese. And I've just come back from there after 20 years. 20 years ago, I was there working with young people who today are grandparents. And they are not just grandparents, but they were deeply shaped by this collective process of effectively creating a monument, not to 500 years of resistance, but and cure. But they're also there recognizing how deeply they were formed, they were shaped by this collective process, 2,000 people working together. And at the same time, how this has not just shaped their educational vision and their cultural vision, but enabled them to reacquire their lost language and to create rituals. Recreate some which they were able to recover, but to create new rituals. So I think I'm talking about now young people who I was working with a few weeks ago, and I'm wearing their beads, their seeds from the Brazil tree, because these young people and all the nearly 300 indigenous peoples, civilizations in Brazil, could be extinct within a few weeks, within a few months, because of the legislation which is likely to be passed in the Senate. It's already passed through the lower house. I mention this because I think we need to listen to those pedagogies that are embedded within an ecocentric life and vision of the world. We need to listen to those. We need to learn from those, but we also need to understand that so much important performance pedagogy, eco-pedagogy, performance-based eco-pedagogy has been developed inside communities outside formal education. I think formal education is crucial. I think the school shouldn't be a theater of complicity, of learning complicity. But I think we need to listen in a new way to those people who've been failed by formal education. We who are trained, let's say, in the subtle use of different instruments, different reflexive, analytical, and creative instruments, need to be listening to these people who have been failed by the very paradigm of education that has brought us to where we are, brought the world to where it is. So I think part of what I'm saying is, having just come back from this Indigenous community, meeting young people who are creating rituals of eco-pedagogy, rituals of passing on knowledge, of preserving knowledge, of valuing a relationship with Mother Nature, a valuing of an interdependent, reciprocal relationship rather than an exploitative industrial relationship. We need to learn from these people, but we also need to understand something really extraordinary. And I think this is where I should end, just to be careful with your time, or at least in a provocative way as well. I remember the head of arts education inside Maraba City, coming from the Federal University, coming into our project, and he said, I want to learn Amazonian, African, indigenous guitar and performance, visual arts, inside your community university of the Valley, of the Rivers. And I said, we're waiting for you, you're expected, please sit down. Here is the person who will be working with you. And he looked at this 14-year-old, and he said, no, I'm not here to learn with people who maybe already have some skill. I'm here to learn with the master, the cultural arts education master. I said, but here is your teacher. And he said, but this is a child. And I said, this child is at least 514 years old. And he sat down, the professor of arts education at the Federal University of Para, and he learned from a 14-year-old. And this 14-year-old to this day doesn't completely understand why she is such a fine teacher, why she is such a fine performer, and where she gets this extraordinary ability to be able to play any instrument that comes into her hands and to pass through that instrument, not just traditional rhythms, but also to create contemporary dance and everything else. And I mention this, or contemporary performance, and contemporary university, Riverside University. And I mention this because perhaps this is very emblematic, very significant in terms of how we might learn in the future. It may well be that this person who had done postdoctoral research in Portugal, who was fluent in talking about decolonization, learned to sit with a young person and to learn from that young person. And it was an exchange. It wasn't in one direction. She learned from his gentleness, from his sensitivity, but he learned that pedagogy is not only a question of skill and preparation and erudition, but pedagogy is also a living relationship with your environment. And I think, tragically, Jeff, this young person teaching the professor of arts education still cannot get into university. So, we're looking at a completely rethought understanding of what is education, what is value in evaluating, and also, above all, what kind of performance of our humanity, of our culture, of our vision, what kind of performance really inspires and nurtures great confidence, sustainable confidence, rather than nurtures respect, perhaps based on reverence. And I think that might be really, really fundamental. This importance of listening to those outside the city center, inside ancient cultures, to together think about not just models of assessment, but in very practical terms, what can be learned from those civilizations that still have a living relationship to every species and every object in nature, rather than a predatory or exploitative relationship based on consuming I think that's a very significant shift, and it may be the only option that we have now on this threshold between ecocide and good living.
Well, Dan, every time that we speak, I am so inspired and inquisitive and question things in a very productive way. I think, it's funny, not funny. It is interesting because one of the projects that we engaged in last year during the pandemic was an exploration of leadership, which is what we were challenged to do. But what we ended up finding was that one of the most important elements of leadership was a process of unlearning, to deconstruct some of these systems which perpetuate inequities and disparities, and in the context of this conversation, the ecocide that you were referencing. But further, that those who are often deemed leaders, in air quotes, because of age, experience, or wisdom, need to actually redefine what eldership could be, meaning, and this was a quote from an Indigenous arts leader in Australia, that we must understand that there are multiple possibilities of truth. And as an elder, we guide others to explore those, not only that their lived experience was truth, but that there are many. And I think you're truly embodying that right now. And I thank you for that. With this podcast, we've gotten to know folks all around the world. So as we come to an end, we always seek to understand what keeps you going. The work that you're describing is challenging and hard. And really, I'm interested in your own processes. So in just a few short one word or one sentence answers, I'd like to ask you the same 5 questions we've asked with all of our guests. So are you ready?
I'm ready. I'll try.
Who inspires you?
At this time, the Indigenous communities I'm working with, and particularly the African Indigenous young people who I have had the honor really to work with over more than a decade.
What keeps you motivated?
Constantly facing new questions in circumstances of great generosity, and seeing these transformations taking place.
Where are you most grounded?
At this time, inside forests.
How do you stay focused?
I think I'm constantly surprised by the humanity and by the resilience of the young people that I work with.
And lastly, why change?
The questions. I think it's always the poetic surprise of story and making new stories. What was your last question?
And lastly, why change?
Well, we have no choice. Now, we've moved, we are on this threshold between ecocide and a viable alternative, a world project at a community level. So we have no choice now as a species. And that is challenging because we have to ensure that people choose this change and are not forced by anybody, and certainly not by fear.
Well, Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us on the Why Change podcast, coming to you live from the World Alliance for Arts Education's Virtual World Summit. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Jeff, a real pleasure to chat with you, and I really hope that the coming podcasts are also as stimulating as you've made this one.